Outlaws don't knock. 3 of them shouldered through the saloon doors in Sulphur Creek, Nevada, sent to collect a price that would cost a quiet stranger his life, and a young widow, the only man standing between her and Aldous Crane. The year was 1879, a Tuesday so hot the flies had quit moving, and nobody in that room yet understood that the man they'd come to kill was the one gun in the territory they should have feared. His name was Barnaby, and he sat with his back to the wall the way careful men always do, one hand loose around a glass of rye, watching the doors the way a wolf watches a tree line. Near the window, close enough to reach if trouble started, sat Prudence Calloway, a young widow with sun-browned hands and a spine that hadn't broken yet, though plenty of men in this county had tried to break it. 3 days before, Barnaby had killed the man who'd been tormenting her for her land, and her refusal to hand it, and herself, over to him. Now that dead man's brother wanted payment, and he'd decided the fastest way to draw Barnaby into the open was to put a price on Prudence, too. Stay with this one to the end, because before the smoke cleared in that saloon, 3 hired guns would learn exactly what the frontier meant when it said the West does not forgive slow men, and one widow would learn just how far a stranger would go for a debt he never asked to owe. Sulphur Creek was not a large town. It had a livery, a mercantile, a church that held maybe 40 souls on a good Sunday, and a saloon that did more honest business than any of them. It sat in a shallow bowl of land between 2 dry ridges, fed by a creek that had stopped running silver decades back, and now just ran, thin and stubborn, past the fence lines of ranches too small to be worth much. Prudence Calloway's ranch was one of those. 40 acres of grass that turned gold in September, a 2-room house her husband Elias had built with his own hands the year they married, and a well that never went dry even in August, which around Sulphur Creek counted as a kind of miracle. Elias had died 3 winters back, thrown from a green horse he shouldn't have been breaking alone, and Prudence had buried him on a rise behind the house where she could see his marker from the kitchen window. She could have sold the place and gone back east to family who wrote her polite, distant letters twice a year. She didn't. She kept the fences mended and the cattle fed, and learned the way widows on that frontier learned everything, by doing it wrong first and doing it right the second time. She was 26 years old, striking in the particular way of a woman who has stopped dressing for anyone but herself. Dark hair she wore loose more often than not, a figure that turned heads in town whether she wanted it to or not. She did not think of herself as beautiful. Everyone else in Sulphur Creek disagreed, and one man in particular had decided her looks and her land were both owed to him. Wade Crane came around the first time 8 months after Elias died, offering condolences that turned within a season into offers to buy her out at half what the land was worth. When she refused, the offers turned into visits she hadn't invited, Wade riding up unannounced at dusk, staying past when politeness allowed, standing too close at the well, remarking on how a woman alone couldn't hold 40 acres through another winter, how much easier things would go for her if she simply saw sense. He never raised a hand to her in daylight where anyone could see it. He was careful that way. But twice he'd gripped her wrist hard enough to bruise when she tried to step past him on her own porch, and once he'd shot her dog, a rangy yellow mutt named Scout, who'd done nothing but bark at him from the yard, and stood there. Wade Crane was the younger brother of a man named Aldous Crane, who owned half the freight routes between Carson City and Reno and had raised Wade to believe that money was a kind of permission slip for anything he wanted. The town said nothing. Sulphur Creek's sheriff was 71 years old and owed the Crane Freight Line for the mortgage on his own barn, and the men who might otherwise have stepped in had families and debts of their own, and no wish to make an enemy of Aldous Crane's money. Prudence learned. Women alone on that frontier so often learned that the law only extended as far as somebody was willing to enforce it, and that willingness was in short supply. She kept a shotgun loaded by the door and slept lighter than she liked to admit, and she told herself, some nights, that she would simply outlast him, that Wade Crane would tire of the game before she broke. She was wrong about that, though not in the way she feared. What actually happened was a stranger rode into Sulphur Creek on a rain-dark afternoon in early August, on a horse the color of a storm cloud, and took a room above the mercantile without saying much to anyone. His name was Barnaby, and if you'd passed him on the street, you might not have looked twice average height. Unremarkable coat, a way of moving that used no more effort than a task required. He had quiet eyes and calloused hands, and carried himself like a man who'd rather not be noticed, which, as it turned out, was exactly the point. Barnaby had been a lot of things in his 34 years, a cavalry scout, a stock detective, a man who'd hired his gun out to more outfits than he cared to count, and had walked away from most of that life some years back, tired of the killing and the kind of men who paid for it. He wasn't looking for trouble in Sulphur Creek. He was passing through on his way to nowhere in particular, the way men without families or fixed addresses tend to drift. But he had a habit, developed over a decade, of staying alive in country that did not forgive carelessness, of noticing things other men missed. And, on his second evening in town, walking back from the livery at dusk, he noticed a woman on her porch trying to pull her wrist free of a man twice her size, while that man laughed like it was a game they both enjoyed. Barnaby did not know Prudence Calloway's name yet. He did not know Wade Crane's either. What he knew, standing at the edge of her yard with the light going purple behind the ridge, was that a woman was afraid and a man was enjoying it, and that was a kind of math he'd never learned to walk away from. He didn't rush the yard or announce himself with noise. He simply walked up the path with his hands visible, his voice pitched to carry exactly as far as it needed to, and no farther. "Lady, looks like she wants her hand back." Wade Crane turned, saw a stranger he didn't recognize, and made the mistake every arrogant man in this story would eventually make. He underestimated what he was looking at. "Mind your own business," he warned, "or find yourself buried on it." Barnaby's answer was quiet and final. This was exactly his business now. He stepped between Wade and the porch stairs, and did not move again. What followed happened 3 days later, not that evening, because Wade Crane was the kind of man who needed to be seen winning, and wouldn't draw down in front of a woman he was trying to intimidate rather than impress. He rode back into town, gathered himself 2 friends for courage, drank through most of an afternoon at the saloon, working up his nerve, and found Barnaby exactly where Barnaby could always be found, sitting quietly, minding his glass, watching the door. Wade called him out into the street in front of half the town, threw around a few choice words about strangers who stuck their noses where they weren't wanted, and made it plain that Prudence Calloway belonged to him one way or another, no drifter's opinion required. Barnaby stood up slow, the way he did everything. Not a threat, just information, the way you'd warn a man the stove was hot. Nobody belongs to anybody out here except by their own choosing. Calloway made her choosing clear a long time before I arrived. Wade Crane called him a liar and reached for his gun first, in front of a dozen witnesses who would all tell the same story afterward. Barnaby's hand moved like something that had been waiting its whole life for exactly this excuse, though his face never lost its stillness. The shot took Wade Crane through the chest before his own gun had cleared leather all the way. He was dead before he hit the dirt of Sulphur Creek's main street, and Barnaby stood over him for a long moment, not with triumph, but with the particular tiredness of a man who has done this kind of arithmetic too many times. The sheriff ruled it a fair fight, because it was won in front of witnesses who couldn't lie about it even if they'd wanted to protect a Crane. Wade Crane was buried 2 days later, and Barnaby, who could have ridden out of Sulphur Creek that same afternoon and left the whole business behind him, did not. He told himself it was because his horse needed rest. That wasn't the whole truth, and he knew it wasn't, even if he wasn't ready yet to look at the rest of it directly. The rest of it was that he'd ridden past Prudence Calloway's gate the morning after the shooting to make sure the trouble hadn't followed him there, and found her mending fence alone in the heat with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and she'd looked at him, but with a kind of clear-eyed appraisal, like she was deciding for herself what kind of man had just rearranged her life without asking. She'd offered him coffee. He'd stayed long enough to drink it and mend 2 fence posts he had no obligation to mend, and ridden back to town, telling himself it was simply the decent thing to do for a woman whose trouble he'd inherited. Over the following 2 weeks, decent turned into something he had less of a name for. He found reasons to ride past her place, checking on a horse he claimed had thrown a shoe near her land, offering to help drive a small herd of her cattle to better grazing, showing up with no real excuse at all on an evening when he simply wanted to see her face across a supper table. Prudence, for her part, stopped flinching when she heard hoofbeats on her road. She started listening for them instead. She was careful with herself the way a woman burned twice by other people's certainty tends to be careful, but she noticed that Barnaby never once made her feel small, never once implied her land or her future were his to arrange, and that noticing did more to open a door in her than any amount of flattery from Wade Crane ever could have. If you're staying with this story, do something for me before we go further. Consider becoming a channel member. It costs you nothing extra. Just tap the join button beside the channel name, and it tells us to keep bringing you stories exactly like this one. Neither of them called it courtship yet. Neither of them had the luxury of slowness that courtship usually asks for, because trouble as it does in this kind of country was already riding north with a letter in its saddlebag. Aldous Crane received the news of his brother's death on a warm evening in Carson City, delivered by a rider who'd made the trip in under 2 days because he knew better than to be slow with news like that. Aldous Crane was 51 years old, owned more of the freight lines between the territorial capital and the mining camps than any 3 of his competitors combined, and had built that empire on the principle that anything could be bought, including the outcome of any dispute, if a man was willing to spend enough on it. He had loved his brother the way certain men love a possession, fiercely, blindly, without much interest in whether the possession deserved it. Wade had been reckless and cruel, and had died because of both those qualities, drawing on an armed man in the street over a woman who'd never wanted him. None of that mattered to Aldous. What mattered was that a nobody drifter had killed a Crane and ridden away from the reckoning, and Aldous Crane did not intend to let that arithmetic stand uncorrected. He sent for a man named Vance Dunmore, who worked out of a rented room above a Carson City stable and had a reputation, in the particular circles where such reputations mattered, as one of the fastest and most reliable guns for hire west of the Rockies. Dunmore was 38, built like a fence post, with a duster, the color of dried mud, and eyes that gave away nothing he didn't intend to give. Aldous Crane laid it out plainly. The drifter, called Barnaby, dead or delivered, and enough money on the table to make either outcome worth the ride. However many men Dunmore needed, Crane would cover it. 2 would do, Dunmore figured. There was a second piece to Aldous Crane's instructions, delivered quieter than the first, in the particular tone men use when they know a thing is beneath them and intend to do it anyway. If Barnaby proved hard to find or slow to show himself, there was a woman in Sulphur Creek the man seemed attached to, and attachment, in Aldous Crane's long experience of buying outcomes, was the surest lever there was. He never spoke the word hurt. He was careful, the way his brother had been careless, to leave that particular door only half open, trusting Dunmore's imagination to walk through it if the situation called for it, frighten her. Make her understand what happens to people who stand near the men Aldous Crane wants dead. That, in Crane's calculation, would be enough to bring Barnaby walking into whatever room. Dunmore rode south with 2 men 3 days later. The younger one was a boy named Jamie Tolliver, barely 20, quick with a gun and quicker still. To talk about how quick he was, the kind of young man who mistakes a fast draw for a whole education in staying alive. The older was a man called Galt, a heavy-set gun hand who'd ridden with Dunmore on 3 prior jobs and asked few questions about the ones that ended badly for somebody else. Neither of them knew, riding south through the heat, that they were 3 days from learning exactly what kind of man they'd been sent to collect. Watered of the Bounty reached Sulphur Creek before Dunmore's party did. The way word of that kind always travels faster than the men carrying it. A freight driver mentioned it at the Mercantile. A hand from a neighboring ranch heard it in a Carson City saloon. By the time Dunmore's 3 horses came down the road into Sulphur Creek on a bright, windless afternoon, most of the town already knew a reckoning was coming and had made itself scarce accordingly. Shutters half drawn. Children called in early from the street, the particular hush of a place that has decided not to be a witness. Dunmore did not go looking for Barnaby first. He'd learned enough, in his line of work, to understand that the fastest way to draw a careful man into the open was never a direct approach. It was pressure applied somewhere he couldn't ignore. So the first stop his party made in Sulphur Creek was Prudence Calloway's gate. She was in the yard when they rode up, hanging wash on a line strung between the house and the barn, and she heard them before she saw them, 3 horses moving at an unhurried pace that had nothing friendly in it. She turned with a wet shirt still in her hands and found 3 strangers reining up at her fence, and something in the set of their shoulders told her, before a word was spoken, exactly what kind of visit this was. Dunmore didn't dismount. He sat his horse at the fence line and looked at her the way a man looks at an item he's pricing, his voice pleasant enough to be worse than shouting. "We're looking for a man called Barnaby. Understand, he's taken a particular interest in your welfare." Prudence set the wash basket down slow. She didn't know the business of every drifter who passed through Sulphur Creek, she told him, flat, unhurried, giving him nothing. Dunmore's smile never touched his eyes. "A shame that, because Mr. Saz." Crane in Carson City had taken a particular interest in her welfare, too. and it would go easier on everyone, her included, if the man she claimed not to know found his way to the saloon by sundown, alone, unarmed, and reasonable. He landed on the word reasonable like it was a threat because it was. Then he touched his hat the way a man does when he wants a thing to look like manners rather than warning, and rode his horse 3 slow steps closer, close enough that Prudence had to fight the instinct to step back, close enough that young Jamie Tolliver, watching from beside him. One more thing. Before he turned his horse back toward town, a woman alone on 40 acres was a fragile kind of asset, and fragile things had a way of breaking if the people responsible for them made poor choices. Then all 3 rode back toward Sulphur Creek, unhurried, leaving Prudence standing at her fence with her heart slamming at her hands, when she finally looked down at them, shaking harder than she wanted anyone to know. She did not wait for the fear to pass before she acted. She saddled her own horse inside of 10 minutes and rode for town, because whatever else Prudence Calloway had learned in 3 years of surviving alone on that land, she had learned that waiting quietly for men like that. Barnaby was at the livery when she found him, and one look at her face was enough. Something had already happened before she got a word out. No crying, no softening it, because she'd decided somewhere on the ride into town that softening it would waste time neither of them had. 3 men, a message from Aldous Crane. A threat wrapped thin enough to look like manners and sharp enough underneath to cut. Barnaby listened without interrupting, and when she finished, something in his face went very still and very quiet, the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he'd hoped never to do again. Leave town for a few days, he suggested, a cousin, a neighbor, anywhere out of Sulphur Creek until this settled. Prudence looked at him for a long moment. No. 3 years of men telling her what to do with her own land and her own life. And she wasn't about to start taking that instruction now from the one man who'd actually earned the right to give it. If Barnaby intended to stand between her and 3 hired guns, she intended to at least stand close enough to see it happen, rather than hide somewhere and wait for news. Barnaby argued. She didn't move an inch. In the end, he asked her only to stay back from the saloon itself, out of the direct line of anything, and she agreed to that much, the only piece of the request she admitted that made any actual sense. He walked her part way back toward the mercantile, where she could watch the street from behind glass without standing in open ground, and before she went inside she caught his sleeve. There was something she hadn't planned to say, and she said it anyway. That she was afraid not of dying exactly, though that fear was in there too, but afraid of the particular helplessness of watching someone else carry a danger that had started, in some real sense, because of her. The danger hadn't started because of her, that much he was certain of. It had started because Wade Crane decided a woman's life was his to spend, and Aldous Crane decided the same thing twice over, and neither of those decisions belonged to her. The only thing that belonged to her now was the choosing of what came next, and she'd already made that choosing plain. Then he touched her hand, once, briefly, and walked toward the saloon. The West does not forgive slow men. Barnaby had learned that lesson a long time before Sulphur Creek, in country far harder than this one, from men who hadn't survived long enough to teach it twice. Speed without judgment got you killed just as surely as hesitation did. What kept a man breathing was something harder to name and harder still to teach, the habit of reading a room before it finished, deciding what it wanted to become, of noticing the half-inch shift of a shoulder before the hand beneath it moved, of understanding that the fastest draw in any saloon belonged 9 times out of 10 to the man who hadn't drawn at all yet because he hadn't needed to. He pushed through the saloon's batwing doors into a room gone dead quiet the moment he entered it. Dunmore was already seated at the round table near the back wall, the one table in the room that watched every door and every window at once, which told Barnaby plainly that this man understood the same lessons he did. Galt stood near the bar, one boot on the rail, hand resting loose an inch from his holster. Jamie Tolliver stood near the window, younger than the others by a decade, trying to hold his face in the same flat stillness the older men wore, and not quite managing it. The bartender had already found reasons to be elsewhere. The dozen or so patrons who'd been drinking away the hot afternoon had drained toward the door in the last several minutes, the particular quiet migration of people who understand, without being told, that something is about to be decided in this room. By the time Barnaby crossed the threshold, the saloon held exactly 5 people who mattered, and nobody else. Dunmore studied him for a long moment. Unremarkable coat, unhurried walk, a face that gave away exactly nothing, and Barnaby watched something like disappointment cross the man's expression, the specific letdown of a hired gun who'd expected a legend and found instead an ordinary-looking stranger in a dusty coat. That disappointment, Barnaby had learned a long time ago, was often the last mistake a dangerous man ever made. "You're the one they call Barnaby." It wasn't really a question. Barnaby crossed to the bar, ordered a glass of rye. He had no intention of finishing, depended on who was asking and what they wanted from the answer. Aldous Crane wanted the man who'd killed his brother, Dunmore explained, plain. Without theater, the way a man states a fact. He expects nobody in the room to dispute, and had put enough money on the table. Barnaby turned to face him fully, glass still in hand. The brother had drawn first, in the street, in front of a dozen witnesses who could all swear to it. Dunmore shrugged, unbothered. That detail hadn't made it into the version of the story Aldous Crane was interested in, and it wouldn't change what happened in the next several minutes. Regardless. 3 men for 1. Barnaby glanced between them without any particular hurry. Crane must think highly of me. Something flickered across Dunmore's face, not quite a smile. Crane had asked for 3. 3 was exactly what he'd brought. Barnaby set his glass down on the bar with a small, deliberate click. That may have been a miscalculation. It was Jamie Tolliver who spoke next, the way young men in a room like that one almost always do, unable to let the silence sit without proving something in it. Heard Barnaby was fast, the fastest gun some folks claimed to have seen in this territory, and wondered aloud what that reputation was worth against 3 men who'd each made their own kind of name in this business. More bravado than sense in the saying of it, his hand hovering near his gun like it was pulled there by something outside his control. Barnaby looked at him for a long moment, the particular look of a man watching someone too young to understand what he was standing inside of. "Speed's killed more good men than slowness ever has, son. Every man who ever drew on me drew fast. Most of them drew first. Not one of them drew last." Jamie's jaw tightened at that, the look of a young man who'd just been handed something true and didn't yet know how to carry it. Ott at the bar hadn't spoken at all. He was the sort who let his gun do whatever talking his character required, and Barnaby had already marked him for exactly what he was: solid, professional, dangerous in the straightforward way of a man who'd done this often enough to stop flinching from it, but without whatever extra instinct separated the merely competent from the truly deadly. Dunmore was the one who worried him. Dunmore's hands hadn't moved once, hadn't twitched, hadn't given away a single tell in the whole conversation. And a man that disciplined, Barnaby knew, was either green enough not to understand the danger he was in or seasoned enough to be the most dangerous person in the room. Watching him, Barnaby settled on the second answer and filed the other two as what came after. "Stand up!" Dunmore's voice had lost whatever thin pleasantness it started with. "We're walking you out of here, one way or the other, and it costs you nothing extra to make it the easy way." Barnaby didn't move from the bar. They weren't walking anywhere together, and before anyone reached for anything, one thing needed saying plainly enough that nobody in the room could claim afterward they hadn't been warned. The widow on the ranch outside town had nothing to do with any of this, had never asked for any of it, and any man who rode near her again, regardless of how this afternoon ended, would answer for it personally and without a second warning given. The debt for Wade Crane's death was his alone to carry, and he intended to see it settled here, today, so that nobody needed to ride toward Prudence Calloway's gate ever again. Dunmore's shoulder dipped a half-inch, the smallest shift, the kind 99 men out of 100 would never catch, the exact tell Barnaby had spent half his life learning to read before it finished happening. Galt's right hand favored a slight lean before it moved, an old habit worn into muscle memory over years of the same draw practiced the same way. Jamie's finger curled around his grip a half-second before the rest of his hand followed. A tell so small, it barely counted as one, except that Barnaby had been counting exactly these kinds of small things for longer than Jamie Tolliver had been alive. "Draw," Dunmore said. What happened next lasted 3 seconds, and every witness who survived to describe it afterward struggled to find the words, because the human eye is not built to follow what a trained hand can do. Barnaby moved the instant Dunmore's shoulder began its dip. Not after it finished. His hand found iron, while Dunmore's was still clearing leather, and the first shot took Dunmore high in the chest, driving him backward over the round table in an explosion of splintering wood. He did not get back up. Barnaby was already turning before Dunmore hit the floor. Galt's gun had cleared its holster by then, the fastest of the three by a fraction, but a fraction was all the difference this kind of arithmetic required. The second shot caught him center mass, the choice a man makes when there's no time left for anything more careful, and Galt folded backward against the bar rail and slid down it slow, his own gun clattering from a hand that no longer had the strength to hold it. 2 seconds gone. Jamie Tolliver had his gun perhaps halfway drawn, his young face gone white, with the particular shock of a man discovering, in real time, that he was about to die for a job he'd taken because it paid better than cattle work. Barnaby turned to face him fully, his own gun already leveled, a thread of smoke still curling from its barrel in the hot afternoon light. He did not fire. He held there, perfectly still, and let the boy see exactly how far past finished this fight already was. The saloon had gone silent, except for the settling creak of the broken table and, from outside, the distant stamp of a horse that had heard gunfire before and knew better than to bolt at it. Barnaby looked at Jamie Tolliver for a long moment before he spoke. "You have family?" Jamie blinked, the question landing somewhere he clearly hadn't expected a gunfight to go. "A mother," he managed, voice smaller than he probably intended, back in a small town north of here, and no father to speak of. Barnaby lowered his gun. Go home to her. The debt Crane thinks he's owed has already been paid twice over in this room. A third grave won't settle it any better than the first two. Jamie stood frozen another half-second, the specific stillness of a young man handed a gift he doesn't yet know how to hold, and then he backed toward the door, turned, and was gone into the afternoon glare. The bat-wing door swung twice behind him and went still. Outside, close enough to have heard every shot without seeing a single one of them, Prudence stood behind the Mercantile's front window, with both hands pressed flat against the glass, and her heart going so hard she could feel it in her throat. When the doors finally swung and it was Barnaby who came through them, upright, unhurt, his coat dusted with plaster from the ceiling, but otherwise whole, the breath she'd been holding for what felt like an hour left her all at once, and she was through the Mercantile door and across the street before she'd fully decided to move. She didn't say anything when she reached him. There wasn't a sentence built for what she wanted to say, so instead, she simply stood close enough that their sleeves touched, and let that closeness say what words weren't going to manage. Barnaby looked down at her, and for the first time since he'd ridden into Sulphur Creek, something in his careful, guarded face came loose, just slightly, just enough for her to see underneath it. The sheriff arrived 20 minutes later, took statements from a dozen witnesses who all told the same story without needing to compare notes first, and ruled it exactly what it plainly was: self-defense against 3 men who'd ridden into town under an outside bounty. Nobody in Sulphur Creek argued the finding. Most of them had spent the last 2 weeks afraid of exactly this kind of trouble arriving on their street and watching it end in 3 minutes, instead of dragging the whole town into a war left a great deal of relief in its wake, even for people who'd never met Prudence Calloway or cared much before today. Whether Aldous Crane's grievances ever got settled, that evening, sitting on the porch of her own house with the sun going down orange behind the ridge, Prudence wanted to know what happened next. Whether 2 dead men and 1 sent home to his mother would be enough to end it, or whether Aldous Crane, wounded now in both his pride and his family, would simply send more. Barnaby didn't answer right away. He'd been turning the same question over through most of the ride back from town, the way he turned over every piece of trouble before deciding what to do about it, and by the time Prudence asked it aloud, he'd already arrived at his answer. Aldous Crane could spend the next 10 years sending men after him, some of them possibly good enough to finish the job someday. Or the whole thing could end here, tonight, if somebody rode north and gave Crane the chance to make a different choice than the one he'd been making. What did that mean, exactly? She pressed. He intended to ride to Carson City himself, alone, and put the choice directly in front of the one man who'd started all of it, instead of waiting for the next 3 guns to come find them first. She didn't like it, and made no effort to hide that, the same directness she'd carried through every hard truth since her husband died. Riding alone into the home ground of a man with money enough to hire an army was a fool's errand, dressed up as courage, and she'd already buried 1 man who thought bravery meant riding toward danger instead of away from it. Barnaby listened to all of it without arguing, understanding the fear underneath the argument better than she probably realized, and when she finished, he gave her the same plain honesty back. As long as Aldous Crane believed there was profit in sending more men, and she would spend the rest of her life listening for hoofbeats on her road that meant trouble instead of neighbors. Better to end it clean on his own terms than let it drag on into something that eventually caught her instead of him. She sat with that a long moment in the cooling dark. If you're going, come back. Not an order. The plainest kind of hope she had left in her, spoken out loud because she decided somewhere in the last 2 weeks that she was done swallowing the things she actually felt just to keep from seeming foolish. He meant it more than he'd meant most things in a long while when he told her he intended exactly that. Before he rode north, a quick ask, if these stories are keeping you company, consider becoming a channel member. Just tap join beside the channel name. Small thing on your end, big help on ours. Carson City sat 2 days' ride north, a territorial capital built on silver money, and the particular kind of ambition that silver money attracts, wide streets and brick buildings, and the settled comfort of a town that had decided long ago it was going to matter. Aldous Crane's house stood on a rise at the edge of town, a solid 2-story structure of good lumber and stone foundation, the kind of place a man builds when he intends to be believed as much as obeyed. Barnaby left his horse in a stand of cottonwoods a 1/4 mile off and covered the rest of the ground on foot, the way he'd covered a great deal of dangerous ground in his life before this one. He watched the house for the better part of 3 hours before he moved, the same patient study he'd have given any dangerous position, noting the 2 guards rotating the porch and the side yard, noting which one kept both hands occupied with his coffee cup and had to set it down before he could draw, noting the gap in their rotation between the rear corner and the kitchen door where, for roughly 40 seconds every hour, nobody was watching that particular stretch of ground at all. Hired muscle, the kind bought with money rather than earned through experience, tended to leave gaps like that. Men who paid for protection instead of building it themselves rarely thought carefully about the spaces their guards couldn't see, trusting that money alone had already solved the problem. Barnaby used the gap when it came. He crossed the open ground low and unhurried, moved through the kitchen door, which stood unlocked, because men with money that comfortable rarely believed anyone would dare come at them from the back of their own house, and made his way through a hall that smelled of pipe tobacco and a meal gone cold hours earlier. A chair sat angled toward the front window, the particular angle of a man who spent his evenings watching the road for news he was afraid to receive. Barnaby sat down in it and waited. Aldous Crane found him there 20 minutes later, coming in from the porch with a cup of coffee that began shaking the instant he registered the stranger sitting calmly in his own parlor chair. He was a heavy-set man, silver-templed, dressed in the kind of fine wool that never quite looked comfortable on men who'd made their money rather than been born to it. His eyes went to the hallway behind him, calculating distance to whatever weapon he kept in this house, and Barnaby watched him work through that calculation and arrive correctly at the understanding that every distance in the room favored the man already sitting down. "Mr. Crane," Barnaby said, and let the silence after it do the rest of the introducing. Crane's first question came out smaller than he probably intended. How had Barnaby gotten past his men? The guards were fine, Barnaby assured him, left exactly where they were posted, this business never having been theirs to carry. Crane's composure gathered itself slowly back around him, the way a man's does when the immediate shock passes and something more familiar, anger, grief, the particular grievance of a man who believes the world owes him a debt. "You killed my brother," the brother had drawn first in front of a dozen witnesses, over a woman who'd never once asked for either brother's attention, and that fact hadn't changed, no matter how many men Crane sent to argue against it. Crane's jaw tightened. 3 good men he'd sent. They had been good, Barnaby agreed, without any satisfaction in the saying. Dunmore especially. disciplined and dangerous in ways that would have unsettled a lesser man. Dunmore and Galt weren't coming back. Jamie Tolliver had gone home to his mother instead, because there was no sense adding a third grave to a debt that had already cost 2 men their lives for a grievance that had never had any real claim behind it in the first place. The color left Aldous Crane's face at that, the particular pale of a man hearing the actual cost of his own certainty spoken back to him plainly for the first time. Barnaby rose from the chair, unhurried, and settled his hat, and laid out the choice left to Crane now as simply as he could manage it. Crane could spend the next 10 years of his life, and however much of his fortune it took, sending more men after him, and some of those men might eventually be good enough to finish what Dunmore couldn't. Or he could let it end here tonight in this parlor, with nobody else needing to die over a debt that had already been paid in full twice over. Crane didn't have to forgive him for Wade, he only had to stop. Crane stood silent long enough that the lamp guttered once in a draft from the hallway. "And if I refuse, if the debt still stands, if I keep sending men regardless of the cost?" His voice had gone hollow with the asking. Barnaby looked at him for a long moment, the same patient, unhurried look he'd given every dangerous thing in this story so far. Then he'd come back. Neither of them would sleep easy again until it was finally settled one way or the other, and the widow in Sulphur Creek, a woman who'd never done anything to Aldous Crane beyond existing and refusing his brother. He turned toward the door without waiting for an answer, understanding by then that no answer given at gunpoint or under the shadow of one would mean anything lasting anyway. Whatever choice Aldous Crane made now, he would have to make it in the cold light of the next morning with nobody standing over him to force it. At the threshold, Barnaby paused and looked back one last time. Wade had drawn first in that street, same as Dunmore had drawn first in that saloon, and every man in this story who'd reached for his gun first had done it, believing speed alone would carry him through. The West didn't work that way, and never had, and the sooner Crane understood that in his own bones instead of hearing it second-hand from other men's graves, the more of his own men he might manage to keep alive going forward. Then he walked out through the front door into the cool Carson City night, and nobody stopped him. He had every reason, riding south the next morning, to wonder whether it had actually worked, whether a man like Aldous Crane, humbled once in his own parlor, would let pride settle into something quieter. Barnaby didn't know, and he told himself on that long ride that he might never know for certain, that some doors close and stay closed for reasons a man never gets to see clearly from the outside. But he'd given Crane the choice cleanly, without ambush, without cruelty, in a way that left the next move entirely in Crane's own hands, and that Barnaby had come to believe over a long, hard life of hard choices. He rode the 2 days back to Sulphur Creek without hurrying, the desert opening wide, and gold around him in the mornings and burning orange at dusk. And he thought, more than once along that road, about a widow on 40 acres who'd told him plainly she wanted him to come back. He had not, in a long while, had anyone waiting on a particular road for a particular man. It sat strangely in his chest, that thought, not unwelcome, just unfamiliar. The way a room feels unfamiliar the first time you realize you might actually get to stay in it. Prudence was in the yard when he rode in on the evening of the second day, hanging wash on the same line where Dunmore had once reined up to threaten her, and she heard his horse before she saw it, and was at the gate before he'd finished dismounting. She didn't ask him right away how it had gone in Carson City. She simply looked at him whole and unhurt, and let that answer enough of the question for the moment, and it was only later, after supper, sitting together on the porch steps with the last light draining out of the sky, that she asked him plainly whether it was over. Barnaby gave her the truth, because he decided somewhere on that long ride back that she deserved it more than she deserved comfort. He didn't know, not with certainty. Aldous Crane had been given a clean choice and nothing more, and what a man did with a clean choice was never something you could guarantee in advance. But Crane had heard, in his own parlor, exactly what it had already cost him, and exactly what it would keep costing, if he chose to keep going. Some men, faced with that arithmetic laid out plainly, he hoped, though he couldn't promise it, that Aldous Crane might turn out to be one of them. Weeks passed in Sulphur Creek after that, and then a month, and no further riders came down the road with bounty papers or veiled threats or any word from Carson City at all. Prudence kept her ranch running, her fences mended, her well drawing sweet water the way it always had, and Barnaby, who had once told himself he was only passing through, found that passing through had quietly turned into something else without either of them formally deciding it. He mended the roof on her barn before the first autumn storms came through. She taught him, with more patience than he probably deserved, how to properly break a green horse without getting himself thrown. Neither of them rushed toward any particular name for what was growing between them. They had both, in their own ways, learned the hard cost of moving too fast in a world that punished exactly that kind of carelessness, and they let this one thing in their lives take the time it actually needed instead. One more ask before we close this out. Becoming a channel member helps this storytelling keep going, and it's as simple as tapping join beside the channel name. Every member matters more than you'd think. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a frontier town after violence has passed through it and decided, finally, not to come back. Not the quiet of nothing happening. Sulphur Creek found that quiet again in the months that followed, the sheriff's office going back to its usual business of minor disputes and stray cattle, the saloon's broken table replaced, and the story of the showdown slowly settling into the kind of thing men told each other over drinks for years afterward. Embellished a little more each time it was told, the way frontier stories always were. Prudence thought sometimes, in the quiet hours before sleep, about how close the whole thing had come to going differently, about Dunmore's tell that Barnaby had caught by half an inch of shoulder movement, about Jamie Tolliver's curled finger that might, in a slower man's hands, have ended with Barnaby dead on that saloon floor instead of standing in it. She thought about the version of her own life where none of that had gone the way it went, where Wade Crane's cruelty had simply continued unanswered because no stranger with quiet eyes had happened to ride through Sulphur Creek at exactly the right moment. She didn't dwell on that version long. She'd learned, the hard way, that dwelling on the worst outcomes life could have handed you rarely did anything but steal the good ones you'd actually been given. Barnaby, for his part, thought less about what had almost happened and more, in his quieter moments, about Rourke, no, about Jamie Tolliver riding home to a mother in a town he'd probably grown up wishing he could leave. Given a second chance he hadn't earned through anything except being young enough and unfinished enough for Barnaby to see something worth sparing. He never learned whether the boy put his gun down for good after that, whether he went back to cattle work or drifted into some other trouble somewhere down the road. Some things Barnaby had come to accept a long time ago. A man simply never got to find out, and he'd made an uneasy peace with that particular kind of not knowing. As for Aldous Crane, the answer came, eventually, in the plainest way it could have, in the not coming. No riders, no bounty papers posted in the next territory over, no word second-hand or otherwise, of a grieving, humiliated man rebuilding his grudge into something worse. Whether Crane had simply run the arithmetic, Barnaby laid out for him and found it wasn't worth the cost, or whether some quieter grief had finally caught up with his anger and outlasted it, nobody in Sulphur Creek ever knew for certain. The debt, whatever shape it had once taken in Aldous Crane's mind, simply stopped being collected. And in that particular country, at that particular time, an ending that arrived quietly and simply stayed ended was worth more than any dramatic reckoning could have been. The West does not forgive slow men. Barnaby had believed that his whole adult life had built his survival on the back of that one hard truth, reading tells and shoulders and half-inch shifts of weight, because the alternative was a grave with his name on it. But sitting on Prudence Calloway's porch as the seasons turned, watching her mend fence with the same stubborn competence she'd brought to every hard thing life had handed her, he came to understand that the lesson went further than gunfights and saloons. The West didn't forgive slowness of courage either, the kind that waits too long to stand for the people worth standing for. It didn't forgive the slowness of a town too afraid to speak against a man with money, or the particular cowardice of looking away from a woman's bruised wrist because getting involved cost something. Speed with a gun had kept Barnaby alive through more reckonings than he could easily count. But it was the willingness to be fast about the right things, to step onto a porch before he even knew a woman's name, to ride 2 days north and offer a grieving man a clean choice instead of a bullet, to let a frightened boy walk out through a set of bat-wing doors instead of adding his blood to a floor that already had enough on it. That had actually changed the shape of his life. Prudence never did go back east to the family that wrote her polite, distant letters twice a year. She stayed on the 40 acres her husband had built with his own hands, and in time the house held 2 names instead of 1, carved quietly into the beam above the door, not because either of them rushed toward that ending. What it cost to move too fast had finally found something worth taking slow and doing right. Barnaby kept his horse, kept his quiet habit of watching doors and reading rooms, kept the particular stillness that had once been a survival skill and had slowly, over that first patient year, become something closer to peace. He never went looking for another reckoning after Carson City. But Sulphur Creek and the widow who'd refused to run from it had a way of making sure that if trouble ever did come looking again, it would find exactly the wrong man standing in its way. That's the story of the 3 hired guns who rode into Sulphur Creek for a widow's protector, and the one man they should have feared but never quite understood until it was already too late. If it kept you company tonight, let us know where in the world you're watching from down in the comments. And stay close for the next one. There's always another town, another quiet stranger, another debt somebody thought they could collect the easy way. The West is a long road, and we're only getting started walking it with you.